The teacup rattled against its saucer in the hand of Commander Mitsuo Fuchida as he stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi. December 7, 1941, 7:49 a.m. Hawaiian time. Around him, veteran pilots shouted celebration codes through crackling radio static, "Tora! Tora! Tora!" confirming total surprise at Pearl Harbor. 6 Japanese carriers had just unleashed their fury upon the American Pacific Fleet, and in the smoke and flame below, 8 battleships lay burning or sinking. Victory tasted absolute. Admiral Nagumo's gambit had worked flawlessly. The Imperial Japanese Navy stood unchallenged in the Pacific, masters of carrier warfare, architects of a new kind of naval supremacy that had crushed the Americans before they could even scramble their fighters. But Commander Fuchida noticed something that morning that troubled him deeply, something his superiors would dismiss for months to come. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in port. They were somewhere out there in the vast Pacific, somewhere beyond his vision. What none of them knew was that those 3 absent flat tops would become the seed of an armada so vast, so technologically overwhelming, that within 3 years, Japanese admirals would order entire fleets to retreat at the mere rumor of American carrier task forces on the horizon. This is the story of how the hunters became the hunted, and how American industrial might transformed the Pacific Ocean into a graveyard of Japanese naval ambition. Standing in that moment of triumph, the men of the Kido, Butai, Japan's elite carrier, strike force could not have imagined that they had awakened something far more terrible than they had destroyed. They had sunk obsolete battleships tethered to pier moorings. They had validated the carrier as the supreme weapon of naval warfare, and they had given America both the motivation and the justification to unleash the full force of its industrial capacity against them. Little did they realize that every carrier they faced in 1941 would be joined by dozens more new carriers, modern carriers, carriers built in months rather than years, carriers supported by logistics, networks, and technological innovations that would make the Imperial Japanese Navy's advantages evaporate like morning mist under a nuclear sun. The dramatic irony is almost Shakespearean in its tragedy. Japan's naval planners knew America's industrial capacity exceeded their own. They had studied American steel production, oil refinement, and manufacturing output. Admiral Yamamoto himself had warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, he had no confidence in victory. They gambled everything on a short, decisive war that would force American negotiation. They couldn't have imagined that America would respond by building carriers faster than Japan could sink them, by training pilots faster than combat could consume them, by developing radar technology and damage control procedures that would turn American carriers into resilient platforms that could absorb punishment and return to battle while Japanese carriers burned and sank from single bomb hits. This would prove to be the most catastrophic miscalculation in naval history. To understand how we got here, we must first understand the naval balance of December 1941. The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed 10 aircraft carriers of various sizes, 6 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers. The United States Navy had 7 carriers. Across both the Pacific and Atlantic theaters, in terms of naval aviation experience, Japan held overwhelming superiority. Japanese carrier pilots averaged 800 flight hours before entering combat. Their senior pilots were combat veterans from China. Their doctrine, developed over a decade of refinement, emphasized offensive striking power and concentrated carrier task forces. They had perfected the massed carrier strike at Pearl Harbor, coordinating 353 aircraft from 6 carriers in a single devastating blow. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic and in the shattered remnants of Pearl Harbor, American naval planners faced a crisis. They had lost 8 battleships in a single morning. They possessed only 3 carriers in the Pacific Enterprise, Lexington and Saratoga with Yorktown, Hornet and Wasp in the Atlantic. American naval doctrine still viewed carriers as scouting platforms and battleship support units. Carrier division commanders were still debating whether multiple carriers should operate together or disperse to avoid concentrated losses. American pilots averaged 305 flight hours, less than half their Japanese counterparts. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters were outmatched by the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0 in speed, climb rate, and maneuverability. American torpedoes were defective, running too deep and suffering catastrophic failure rates. But hidden in American shipyards were the seeds of Japan's doom. The Essex-class carrier program, authorized in 1940, called for 32 ships. The Independence-class light carrier program would convert 9 cruiser hulls into fast carriers. The escort carrier program would eventually produce 122 ships. American war planners weren't thinking in terms of replacing losses. They were thinking in terms of overwhelming numerical superiority. They were planning to build a carrier fleet so vast that it could absorb losses, sustain continuous operations, and appear in multiple theaters simultaneously. But nothing could prepare the Japanese for the psychological shock of what was coming. Nothing in their doctrine, their experience, or their strategic planning accounted for the possibility that within 24 months they would face carrier task forces containing more ships than they had started the war with. The first shock came on April 18, 1942, when 16 American B-25 bombers, land-based bombers that had no business operating from carrier decks, somehow launched from the carrier Hornet 650 miles from Tokyo and struck the Japanese homeland. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, who had led the Pearl Harbor fighter escort, was on home leave in Tokyo when the bombs began falling. He later wrote in his diary, "I stood in the street and watched American bombers fly over the Imperial Palace. We were told the homeland was invulnerable. We were told our carrier strike force controlled the Pacific. How did they reach us? How many carriers do they have now? The questions haunt me more than the explosions." The Doolittle raid inflicted negligible physical damage, 50 people killed, 90 buildings damaged. But the psychological demolition was absolute. The Japanese High Command, humiliated that enemy bombers had violated sacred airspace, made a fateful decision. They would expand the defensive perimeter by seizing Midway Island. They would draw out the American carriers and destroy them in decisive battle. Admiral Yamamoto committed Japan's full carrier strength, 4 fleet carriers of the Kido Budai to the operation. It was the same force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, the same experienced crews, the same doctrine of overwhelming offensive power. And then they saw what happened when American intelligence broke Japanese naval codes and turned the ambush around. June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway began as Japanese confidence expected. Their aircraft struck Midway Island while American torpedo bomber squadrons threw themselves uselessly against Japanese carriers, losing 41 of 45 aircraft without scoring a single hit. Aboard Akagi, the same commander, Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, was recovering from appendix surgery. Watching the battle unfold, Japanese fighter cover had been drawn down to wave-top level pursuing American torpedo bombers. Japanese carriers had their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. At 10:22 a.m., dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown rolled into their attacks through undefended skies. In the span of 5 minutes that would be studied in naval academies for the next 8 decades, 3 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were transformed into floating infernos. Hiryu would follow hours later. 4 fleet carriers lost, over 250 aircraft destroyed, more than 3,000 experienced crew, and irreplaceable pilots killed. Japan's margin of carrier superiority evaporated in less time than it takes to hard-boil an egg. Fuchida survived the destruction of Akagi with both legs broken, evacuated as the carrier blazed from bow to stern. He would later write, "I watched our carriers burn and thought, we can rebuild ships, but those pilots, those mechanics, those experienced deck crews, they are gone. And the Americans, how many carriers did they sacrifice to achieve this? We believed we faced 3. They brought 3 to Midway. How many more are coming?" But this was nothing compared to what Japanese naval intelligence was about to discover in their shipping traffic analysis. By August 1942, Japanese naval intelligence began intercepting Americans. Radio traffic that made no sense. References to carriers with names like Essex, Intrepid, Hornet, but hadn't Hornet participated in Doolittle? Wasp, Atlantic Fleet, Franklin, Ticonderoga, Randolph, Lexington, but Lexington sank at Coral Sea. The intercepts suggested not replacement carriers, but additional carriers, new construction, ships that hadn't existed 6 months ago. The mathematics seemed impossible. Kaigun, the Imperial Japanese Navy, required 3 to 4 years to construct a fleet carrier. American shipyards were claiming completion times of 15 to 18 months. Intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Yahachi, Tanabe compiled a report in September 1942 was marked most secret and delivered only to the Naval General Staff. Captured American documents and prisoner. Interrogations suggested the United States had authorized 32 Essex-class carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and was converting merchant hulls into escort carriers at an unprecedented rate. Tanabe's report concluded, if these figures are accurate, and I have reason to believe they are conservative, the enemy will achieve carrier numerical superiority by mid-1943 and overwhelming superiority by 1944. Our current carrier construction program cannot match this pace. We are building ships. They are building fleets. The Naval General Staff filed the report and continued planning offensive operations. They had no choice. To acknowledge the implications would be to acknowledge the war was already lost. Even more disturbing was the realization that began, creeping through staff briefings. American carriers weren't just numerous, they were different. They were being built with lessons learned from Pearl Harbor and Midway incorporated into their design. Stronger flight decks, better damage control, more anti-aircraft guns, improved radar. They were coming not just in greater numbers, but in more advanced iterations. In January 1943, newly promoted Rear Admiral Mark Mitchell assumed command of Fleet Air, Solomon Islands. He began implementing a doctrine that would revolutionize carrier warfare, the Fast Carrier Task Force. Instead of dispersing carriers to reduce vulnerability, Mitchell concentrated them into multi-carrier task groups with interlocking defensive circles of cruisers and destroyers. Each task group contained 3 to 4 carriers. Multiple task groups operated as a coordinated task force, capable of launching strikes with 200, 300 aircraft, more aircraft than Japan had launched against Pearl Harbor, while maintaining constant fighter cover and conducting around-the-clock operations. Japanese pilots, encountering these new formations, began reporting something that horrified Kaigun headquarters. They couldn't tell how many American carriers they were facing. The fighter screens were so dense, the anti-aircraft fire so coordinated, that Japanese strike aircraft were being decimated before they could even identify specific targets. Petty Officer Kiyoshi Kobayashi, a veteran dive bomber pilot who survived 6 months of Solomon Islands combat, recorded in his diary, "Today we struck at what intelligence said was 2 carriers. We counted fighters from 4 carriers in the air simultaneously. How many carriers do they have? How can they maintain so many aircraft aloft? Our fighters land, refuel, rearm 20 minutes minimum. Their fighters seem to always be in the air. It's as if they have unlimited aircraft and unlimited pilots. We lose 5 pilots today. 5 more yesterday? They are not veterans anymore, the new pilots. They have 30 hours in type. They die in their first missions. The Americans keep coming." The cumulative impact of these operational innovations was stark. By mid-1943, American carrier task forces could launch strikes every hour, sustain combat air patrols continuously, and absorb damage that would have sunk Japanese carriers while remaining operational. When Yorktown was hit by torpedoes at Midway, she sank. When Essex took a kamikaze hit off Luzon, she repaired in 3 days and returned to combat operations. November 20th, 1943, Operation Galvanic, the invasion of Tarawa and Makin in the Gilbert Islands. Japanese intelligence analysts in Truk compiled reconnaissance reports with increasing desperation. The American invasion force included 6 fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, and 8 escort carriers, 19 carriers supporting a single operation. The entire Imperial Japanese Navy possessed 9 operational carriers at this point, scattered across the Pacific and under repair from accumulated damage. The Americans were deploying 19 carriers in one location, while simultaneously maintaining carrier operations in the Solomon Islands, supporting operations in New Guinea, and keeping Atlantic Fleet carriers operational for European operations. Captain Toshikazu Omai, a staff officer at Truk, drafted a memo that circulated among senior leadership but was never officially acknowledged. The enemy is fighting multiple wars simultaneously with carrier forces that individually outnumber our entire remaining fleet. They are advancing across the Central Pacific, while maintaining pressure in the South Pacific. They are replacing losses within weeks. They are training pilots in 6 months who, while not equal to our veterans in skill, are adequate in sufficient numbers. Most critically, they can afford to lose carriers. We cannot. This asymmetry is unsustainable. The memo was correct but understated the crisis. Japanese carriers had become so precious, so irreplaceable, that they were being held in reserve for decisive battle, a final climactic engagement that would turn the tide. But the Americans refused to cooperate with Japanese doctrine. They simply advanced across the Pacific, neutralizing island garrisons with carrier strikes, never concentrating their fleet in a location where Japan could bring its reserves to bear for the decisive battle. The psychological effect on Japanese naval officers was corrosive. They possessed carriers but couldn't deploy them without risking loss. They were being strategically defeated by an enemy who didn't even need to sink. Their carriers merely forced them to remain in port was sufficient. By June 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy could no longer avoid decisive battle. The American invasion of Saipan threatened the inner defensive perimeter. Loss of Saipan would put B-29 bombers within range of Tokyo. Admiral Jusaburo Ozawa sortied with Japan's remaining carrier strength, 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, embarking 473 aircraft. It was the last substantial carrier force Japan could assemble. Opposing them, Admiral Mitchell commanded Task Force 58, 7 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, and 956 aircraft. The Americans outnumbered Japanese carrier aircraft 2-1 and possessed hundreds more land-based fighters on recently captured islands. What happened on June 19, 1944, over the Philippine Sea became known to American pilots as the Great Marianas. Turkey shoot, Japanese strike waves were intercepted 45 miles from American carriers by massed fighter screens directed by radar. Of 373 Japanese carrier aircraft committed to the battle, 330 were shot down. American losses: 23 aircraft in air combat. Japanese pilot warrant officer Yoshimura Tomoyoshi survived being shot down twice that day, rescued after the second by a Japanese destroyer. His account, recorded after his repatriation in 1945, captured the psychological collapse. I flew in the third wave. The radio was screaming, "Everyone dying." I saw American fighters everywhere, like clouds of hornets. I never saw their carriers. I don't know if I got within 10 miles of them. I dropped my bomb in the ocean and ran. They shot me down anyway. In the water, I watched my carrier, Hio, explode from submarine torpedoes. The Empire sent 9 carriers to this battle. How many came back? 5. How many aircraft? Maybe 50. I learned later the Americans lost so few carriers that I cannot even tell you the number. It was 0. 0 carriers sunk. This is not battle. This is extermination. The numbers told a story that Japanese admirals could no longer deny, but the full horror was still to come. By autumn 1944, the mathematics of American carrier construction had become an avalanche of steel and industrial capacity that defied Japanese comprehension. The Essex class program had delivered 14 fleet carriers to the Pacific Fleet. 9 Independence-class light carriers were operational, and the escort carrier program, initially viewed as a stopgap measure, had produced 78 carriers, with 44 more under construction or fitting out. The total, 101 American carriers in commission by October 1944. Japan had started the war with 10 carriers. They currently possessed 4 operational fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, with 2 under repair and unlikely to return to service. The production tempo revealed even more disturbing trends. The carrier Essex, lead ship of her class, took 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. February 1941 to December 1942, the carrier Bonn, Homme Richard, 15th of the class, required 14 months. February 1943 to April 1944, American shipyards weren't just building carriers. They were becoming more efficient with each iteration. Newport News Shipbuilding, New York Naval Shipyard, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, Bethlehem Steel, and Norfolk Navy Yard were simultaneously constructing carriers on parallel slips, incorporating design improvements in real time, and delivering ships at a rate Japan couldn't match. Even if they converted their entire merchant shipbuilding capacity to carrier construction, the comparison to Japanese construction was devastating. Japan laid down the carrier Unryu in August 1942 and commissioned her in August 1944, 24 months. That single carrier took longer than America required to build. 6 Essex-class fleet carriers, and Unryu was smaller, lighter, and less capable than an Essex. Japan completed 3 Unryu-class carriers during the war. America completed 14 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and 122 escort carriers. The production ratio was 24 American carriers for every one Japanese carrier. But the carriers themselves were only part of the story. The mathematics of victory were written in supporting infrastructure. Every Essex-class carrier required a battle group, 2 to 3 cruisers, 8 to 10 destroyers, 2 fleet oilers, ammunition ships, repair vessels, and supply transports. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had assembled Fleet Train, a mobile logistics network of 544 support vessels that could refuel, rearm, and resupply carrier task forces at sea without returning to port. Task Force 58 operated continuously in the Western Pacific from January to August 1944. 8 months launching strikes on Truk, Palau, Hollandia, the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and the Philippines while refueling at sea every 4 days and rearming every week. The Japanese possessed no equivalent logistics system. Japanese carriers operated from fixed bases, Truk, Singapore, Kure, and required port facilities for refueling and rearming between operations. When American submarines and long-range aircraft made forward bases untenable, Japanese carriers lost their operational flexibility. By late 1944, Japanese carriers were effectively confined to the inland sea of Japan, where they could be protected by land-based air cover but were strategically useless. They had become museum pieces in their own navy. The magnitude of American logistical superiority extended to every aspect of carrier operations. Aviation gasoline. American carriers consumed 100-octane fuel refined from unlimited petroleum reserves. Japanese carriers used fuel refined from East Indies crude oil of lower quality, transported through submarine-infested shipping lanes, and rationed due to critical shortages. By October 1944, Japan's fuel reserves were so depleted that carrier training was suspended. New pilots joined operational units without carrier landing qualifications because there wasn't enough fuel to practice deck landings. Aircraft replacement. When an American carrier lost aircraft to combat or operational accidents, replacements arrived from escort carriers serving as aircraft transports, from advanced bases, or from the carrier's own reserve aircraft. A typical Essex-class carrier embarked 90 to 100 aircraft, with space for 30 to 40 more in reserve. Japanese carriers operated with minimal reserves. Lost aircraft meant reduced strike capability until the carrier returned to Japan for replacement, a journey that took weeks and exposed the carrier to submarine attack the entire way. The cumulative impact of American technological development created carrier task forces that operated on a different plane of capability than their Japanese counterparts. American carriers were equipped with SEAG-SAM and SK radar systems that detected incoming aircraft at 80 to 100 miles, providing 30 minutes warning for fighter scrambles. Japanese carriers relied primarily on visual observation, reducing warning time to minutes. This technological gap meant American carriers could vector fighters to intercept enemy aircraft long before they reached attack range, while Japanese carriers were surprised by attacks they never saw coming. American carriers employed CIC Combat Information Center, a dedicated compartment where radar data, radio communications, and tactical plotting were integrated into a comprehensive picture of the battle space. A single CIC officer aboard Lexington could direct 60 fighters to intercept multiple incoming raids, coordinate fleet anti-aircraft fire, and manage combat air patrols simultaneously. Japanese carriers had no equivalent system. Fighter direction was conducted from the bridge via radio, with limited situational awareness and no centralized coordination. Damage control capabilities revealed another technological chasm. American carriers incorporated lessons from British carrier design: armored hangars, redundant fire suppression systems, multiple fire pumps, foam generators, and most critically, extensive training in damage control procedures. Every sailor aboard an American carrier trained in firefighting, hull breach repair, and casualties response. When Franklin was hit by 2 bombs off Okinawa in March 1945, fires raged through her hangar deck, magazines exploded, and 807 crew members died, but the ship survived. The crew contained the fires, jettisoned burning aircraft, and restored propulsion. Franklin returned to Brooklyn under her own power. Japanese carriers lacked this resilience. When Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced fleet carrier, took a single torpedo hit at the Philippine Sea battle, aviation fuel vapors accumulated in the hangar deck due to inadequate ventilation. 7 hours after the torpedo hit, the accumulated vapors ignited, triggering catastrophic explosions that destroyed the ship. One torpedo, one hit, ship gone. The same torpedo hitting an Essex-class carrier would have caused flooding, list, and casualties, but not loss of the ship. Perhaps the most catastrophic advantage lay in pilot training pipelines. By 1944, the United States was training 100,000 pilots per year across all aviation branches. The Navy received 15,000 newly trained pilots in 1944 alone. Training lasted 18 months and included 600 hours of flight time. Before carrier qualification, new pilots arrived at carrier air groups with 250 hours in type-specific aircraft. They weren't veterans, but they were competent. And they were numerous enough that losses could be absorbed without degrading overall capability. Japan's pilot training program had collapsed under the weight of losses and fuel shortages. In 1941, Japanese naval pilots required 3 years of training and emerged with 800 flight hours. By 1944, training lasted 6 months with 100 hours, total flight time, and perhaps 30 hours in combat aircraft. New pilots arrived at carrier air groups unable to perform carrier landings, night operations, or gunnery. They were sent into combat against experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft supported by overwhelming numbers. The result was predictable. Japanese pilot losses accelerated, while replacement pilot quality degraded, creating a death spiral of decreasing effectiveness. American pilot survival rates exceeded Japanese rates by dramatic margins due to superior aircraft, better rescue procedures, and overwhelming numerical superiority. When an American pilot was shot down near friendly forces, lifeguard submarines, stationed specifically for pilot rescue, would extract him within hours. When an American pilot crashed near enemy territory, seaplanes escorted by dozens of fighters would attempt rescue. American pilots knew that being shot down didn't mean death or capture. It meant a few days off before returning to combat. Japanese pilots knew being shot down meant death. This psychological disparity affected combat aggressiveness, risk calculation, and morale. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, spent the remainder of the war in staff positions, recovering from his midway injuries and serving as a naval aviation analyst. His diary entries from late 1944, recovered after the war, provide a window into the psychological state of Japanese naval officers who understood the arithmetic of defeat. October 3, 1944, I attended planning meetings for the Philippines defense. We will commit everything, all remaining carriers, all battleships, all heavy cruisers. It is our last chance for decisive battle. If we fail, the Navy ceases to exist as a fighting force. I proposed we hold carriers in reserve until American intentions are clear. I was shouted down. We must attack. We must seek decisive battle. We must destroy American carriers, but how? We cannot even find their carriers before they strike us. Their radar sees our approach. Their fighters intercept before we reach attack range. Their carriers absorb hits and continue fighting. How do we sink them? I have no answer. None of us have answers anymore. We plan operations knowing they will fail. We commit ships knowing they won't return. And still the orders come: attack, decisive battle, victory. The words have lost meaning. Fuchida survived the war and later converted to Christianity, becoming a missionary. He never participated in combat after Midway, but his writings provide remarkable insight into how Japanese naval officers processed the psychological demolition of watching their technological and tactical advantages evaporate against American industrial capacity and innovation. Seaman First Class Robert Bobby Brewer served aboard Essex, from her commissioning through VJ Day, participating in nearly every major carrier operation in the Pacific. His letters home to his mother in Sacramento, donated to the National War Museum, provide an enlisted sailor's perspective on the transformation of American carrier power. February 1943, shortly after Essex joined the fleet. Mom, you should see this ship. She's enormous. They say she's twice the displacement of Enterprise and carries more aircraft. The hangar deck is like a factory floor, aircraft everywhere, mechanics working around the clock. The captain says we're the first of many. There are a dozen more just like Essex being built right now. The Japs have no idea what's coming. November 1943, after operations in the Gilbert Islands, we launched strikes on Tarawa alongside Bunker Hill, Independence, Belleau Wood, and 2 other carriers I couldn't even see over the horizon. 6 carriers just for Tarawa. The old salts say at Coral Sea we had 2 carriers total. Now we have 6 in one place and more operating elsewhere. I met a pilot from Yorktown, the New Yorktown, not the one that sank at Midway. He said there's 3 carriers named after carriers we lost. Yorktown, Lexington, Hornet. For every carrier the Japs sink, we build 3 more. How do you fight that? June 1944, after the Philippine Sea Battle. The Marianas Turkey Shoot, that's what the pilots are calling it. Mom, it was slaughter. Japanese planes were falling out of the sky like flies. I was on a damage control party standing by for kamikaze hits. We never got touched. I don't think Japanese planes got within 5 miles of us. Our fighters intercepted them before we even saw them on the horizon. I talked to a pilot from below. Wood, he said he splashed 3 Jap planes in 15 minutes and got bored waiting. For more targets, bored in combat. How do you fight an enemy who's bored shooting you down? These voices Japanese officers confronting inevitable defeat. American sailors witnessing overwhelming power form a counterpoint throughout the final year of the war. The personal, individual experience of this transformation reveals something statistics cannot: the human dimension of technological and industrial supremacy. October 23, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf began as the largest naval battle in history and concluded as the death knell of Japanese carrier aviation. Admiral Ozawa commanded the Northern Force. 4 carriers with exactly 116 aircraft embarked, barely 1/4 normal capacity. But Ozawa's carriers weren't intended to fight. They were bait, decoys. Their mission was to lure American carriers north, away from Leyte Gulf, allowing Japanese battleships to penetrate the landing beaches and massacre American invasion forces. The plan worked partially. Admiral Halsey took the bait, racing north with Task Force 38 to destroy what he thought was the last major Japanese carrier force. On October 25th, American carrier aircraft found Ozawa's decoy force and proceeded to annihilate it. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo bombers struck the Japanese carriers with methodical efficiency. The carrier Zukaku, the last surviving carrier of the Pearl Harbor attack force, took multiple torpedo hits, developed a 15-degree list, and sank stern first after her crew was evacuated. The carriers Zuiho, Chiyoda, and Chitose were destroyed in succession. Of the 116 Japanese aircraft embarked on Ozawa's carriers, perhaps 30 escaped destruction. The rest were shot down, destroyed on deck, or lost when their carriers sank. Admiral Ozawa survived, rescued by a destroyer as his flagship Zuikaku went down. His report to Naval General Staff was stark: mission accomplished. Carriers destroyed as planned, American carriers successfully lured away from Leyte Gulf. But surface force failed to exploit the opening. Battleships turned back before reaching landing beaches. Carriers sacrificed for nothing. The final revelation came when Ozawa learned the scope of American carrier strength. At Leyte, Halsey had sortied north with 8 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, 16 carriers, leaving 8 more supporting operations at Leyte Gulf. 24 American carriers operating simultaneously in a single theater. Ozawa had sacrificed 4 carriers to draw away 16, and it hadn't even depleted American carrier presence at Leyte. The arithmetic was annihilating. By November 1944, the transformation was complete. The Imperial Japanese Navy no longer possessed a functional carrier force. 4 carriers remained: Amagi, Katsuragi, Unryu, and the hybrid battleship carrier Iza. They had no aircraft. They had no trained pilots. They had no fuel to conduct operations even if aircraft and pilots materialized. They remained anchored in the inland sea, camouflaged against air attack, strategically irrelevant. Japanese naval officers who had spent their entire careers preparing for carrier warfare found themselves commanding empty ships. Captain Toshio Eba, executive officer of Amagi, wrote in his personal journal, "My carrier has no aircraft. We conduct training exercises with wooden models on the flight. Deck playing pretend like children. Pilots come aboard who have never landed on a carrier. Deck because there is no fuel for training. They practice with chalk marks on airfield runways. We are becoming a cargo ship with a wooden deck. The Americans have 20, 30, perhaps 40 carriers operating from Ulithi. Atoll, we have 4 ships playing pretend in the inland sea. This is not a navy. This is a museum." The most powerful diary entry came from Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa himself, the man who sacrificed the last Japanese carriers at Leyte Gulf. His diary, recovered by occupation forces in 1945, contained an entry dated November 15, 1944. I have commanded carriers for 4 years. I led the mobile fleet at Philippine, Sea, and Leyte Gulf. I have studied American carrier doctrine, American tactics, American technology. I understand now what we failed to grasp in 1941. We attacked Pearl Harbor to destroy American battleships. We succeeded, but we validated the carrier as the dominant naval weapon and then challenged the world's greatest industrial power to a carrier construction race. We sank Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, Wasp. They built Essex, Intrepid, Bunker Hill, Franklin, Lexington again, Yorktown again, Hornet again, and 30 more we never sank. We built Unru, 1 carrier. Our best effort produced 1 carrier, while they launched 6 in the same period. And still our leaders speak of victory. There is no victory. There is only delay of inevitable defeat. The Americans don't need to destroy our carriers anymore. They simply need to appear on the horizon, and we order full retreat. The hunters have become the hunted. The transformation is complete. The ultimate expression of this transformation occurred in the war's final months, when Japanese naval doctrine abandoned offensive carrier operations entirely and adopted a strategy of pure survival. When American carriers appeared, Japanese ships retreated. Not tactical withdrawal, full retreat, abandoning operational areas without engaging. March 1945, Task Force 58, comprising 11 fleet carriers and 5 light carriers, launched Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa. Japanese carriers Amagi, Katsuragi, and Ryuho remained in Kure Harbor, stripped of their remaining aircraft to provide land-based air defense. When American carrier aircraft struck Kure Naval Base on March 19th, the carriers didn't sortie to defend themselves. They couldn't. They had no aircraft, no pilots, and insufficient fuel to reach open water. The carriers sat at anchor while American bombs fell around them, returning fire with anti-aircraft guns, designed to support fighter cover that no longer existed. April 1945, the super battleship Yamato was dispatched on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa, loaded with only enough fuel for a single voyage. No carrier supported this operation. No fighter cover protected Yamato from air attack. American carriers detected Yamato 200 miles from Okinawa and dispatched 380 aircraft to destroy her. In 2 hours of continuous attack, Yamato took at least 12 bomb hits and 7 torpedo hits before capsizing and exploding. Over 3,000 sailors died. The battleship the weapon carriers had made obsolete sailed unsupported to its death because Japan no longer possessed functional carrier aviation. By VJ Day, August 15, 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed 4 aircraft carriers, Amagi, Katsuragi, Hosho, and Ryuho. All 4 were in port, damaged by air attacks, stripped of aircraft, and awaiting scrapping. The U.S. Navy possessed 99 carriers, 28 fleet and light carriers in active combat operations, 71 escort carriers, supporting invasions or conducting anti-submarine patrols. The final ratio was 25 American carriers operational for everyone. Japanese carrier in existence. The most powerful symbol of this transformation occurred in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. The Japanese instrument of surrender was signed aboard the battleship USS Missouri, but surrounding Missouri in Tokyo Bay were 16 American aircraft carriers, fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers anchored in Japanese home waters as a demonstration of overwhelming naval power. They sat where Japan's carrier force had assembled in November 1941 to attack Pearl Harbor. The transformation was complete. From 3 American carriers fleeing Pearl Harbor to 16 American carriers anchoring in Tokyo Bay accepted surrender documents in waters Japan once controlled. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack and spent the war analyzing Japan's defeat, survived to become an unlikely Christian missionary. He traveled to the United States in 1952, speaking at churches and universities about forgiveness and reconciliation. He met with Jacob de Shazer, a Doolittle raider who became a missionary in Japan. The two formed a friendship, the man who attacked Pearl Harbor and the man who bombed Tokyo, reconciled through shared faith. Fuchida published his memoir, For That One Day, in 1952, which included a detailed analysis of why Japan lost the carrier war. We saw carriers as offensive weapons to be risked for decisive battle. America saw carriers as industrial products to be built in overwhelming numbers. We couldn't replace what we lost. They built faster than we could sink. The transformation wasn't tactical. It was industrial, and we had no counter. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who commanded the decoy carrier force at Leyte Gulf, was interviewed extensively by American naval historians after the war. His assessment was blunt. American carriers appeared in groups of 4, 6, 8 at a time. We faced 16 carriers at Leyte Gulf and learned there were 8 more at the landing beaches. 24 carriers in one operation. We possessed 4 carriers total, used as bait, as decoys, as sacrifices. You cannot fight a war where your entire fleet equals 1/4 of the enemy's presence in a single theater. The surprise wasn't that we lost. The surprise is that we believed we could win. Admiral Mark Mitcher, who commanded Fast Carrier Task Force operations, from 1943-1945, became Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air after the war. He died in 1947 at age 60, exhausted from 3 years of continuous Pacific operations. His legacy was the Fast Carrier Task Force, doctrine concentrating multiple carriers into coordinated striking forces, which became standard U.S. Navy procedure for the next 80 years. Every American carrier battle group from the Korean War through modern supercarrier strike groups traces its doctrinal lineage to Mitcher's 1943 innovations. Seaman First Class Robert Brewer, the Essex sailor who documented carrier operations in letters home, returned to Sacramento in October 1945. He used GI Bill benefits to attend college, became a high school history teacher, and never spoke publicly about his war service until 1995, when the 50th anniversary of VJ Day prompted local media interviews. His assessment: people ask what it was like serving on a carrier. I tell them it was boring, punctuated by terror, but mostly boring. We were so powerful, so numerous, that Japanese forces usually retreated before we arrived. By 1945, we were launching strikes on targets that didn't shoot back because Japanese air defense had collapsed. We won the war, but victory felt inevitable by then. The question wasn't if we'd win, but when. The Essex-class carriers, built in 18 months to win a war, served for decades beyond their designers' expectations. 14 Essex-class carriers were commissioned during Watai. 13 survived the war. Several were modernized with angled flight decks, steam catapults, and jet aircraft capability, serving through the Vietnam War. Lexington, CV-16, commissioned in 1943, served as a training carrier until 1991. 48 years of service and is now a museum ship in Corpus Christi. Texas, Intrepid, CV-11 is a museum in New York City. Yorktown, CV-10 is preserved in Charleston, South Carolina. The ships built to overwhelm Japan became the backbone of American naval power through the Cold War. The 4 surviving Japanese carriers were destroyed in July-August 1945 by American carrier aircraft strikes on Japanese ports. Amagi capsized after bomb damage at Kure, Katsuragi, was heavily damaged but survived to be scrapped in 1947. Hosho, Japan's first aircraft carrier, commissioned in 1922, survived the war and was scrapped in 1947. Ryuho was heavily damaged and scrapped in 1946-1947. None survived as museum ships. None served post-war. They were industrial wreckage, obsolete before the war ended, victims of the production race they couldn't win. The contrast between American and Japanese carrier fates reflects the broader transformation. American carriers were so numerous they became disposable. Several Essex-class ships never saw combat and were placed in reserve. Immediately after commissioning, Japanese carriers were so precious they couldn't be risked in combat, rendering them strategically useless. The Americans could afford to lose carriers and did. 11 were sunk during the war but replaced them faster than Japan could sink them. Japan couldn't afford to lose any carriers, so they stopped deploying them, which meant they lost strategic control of the Pacific without losing ships. The transformation was psychological as much as material. The carrier innovations developed during WO became foundational for modern naval aviation. The Combat Information Center, pioneered on American carriers in 1943, evolved into modern Aegis combat systems, steam catapults, angled flight decks, mirror landing systems, and automated carrier landing systems all trace lineage to WO2 innovations. Modern supercarriers, Nimitz-class and Gerald. Our Ford-class ships are direct descendants of Essex-class design philosophy. Large, resilient, capable of sustained operations, supported by sophisticated logistics networks. The Japanese learned these lessons thoroughly. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, established in 1954, initially operated no carriers, prohibited by post-war constitution. But in recent decades, Japan has commissioned helicopter destroyers that are functionally aircraft carriers Hyuga, Ise, Izumo, and Kaga. The names are significant. Ise and Kaga are named after W-2 carriers that were destroyed. The modern Kaga can operate F-35B stealth fighters, making it a legitimate light carrier. Japan has come full circle from dominating carrier warfare in 1941 to losing every carrier by 1945 to re-establishing carrier capability 80 years later, having learned the lessons America taught. Carriers aren't weapons to be risked in decisive battle. They're platforms to be built in sufficient numbers to sustain continuous operations. In the end, Japan's greatest tactical weapon, the carrier, strike force that stunned the world at Pearl Harbor, became the instrument of its strategic defeat. By validating the aircraft carrier as the dominant naval weapon, Japan challenged America to a production race it couldn't win. The transformation from December 7, 1941, when Commander Fuchida's pilots struck Pearl Harbor from 6 carriers, to October 25, 1944, when American pilots destroyed the last Japanese fleet carriers while operating from 16 carriers in a single task force, represents one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. The story of this transformation stands as a testament to an uncomfortable truth. Wars are fought by warriors but won by factories. Japanese pilots were more experienced in 1941. Japanese carriers were better designed. Japanese doctrine was more sophisticated. But Japanese industry couldn't match American production capacity, American innovation tempo, or American logistical systems. When industrial capacity became the decisive variable, tactical excellence became irrelevant. Japan fought brilliantly with the forces it had. America built forces faster than Japan could destroy them. Mathematics overwhelmed courage. The deeper lesson resonates beyond Wellwood. Technological and tactical superiority are temporary advantages that can be overcome by superior production and logistics. The side that can absorb losses, learn from mistakes, and return to battle with improved forces possesses a decisive strategic advantage that compensates for initial inferiority. The carrier task forces that terrified Japanese admirals into retreat weren't individually superior to Japanese carriers. They were numerous, resilient, supported, and replaceable. American carrier doctrine succeeded because it treated carriers as production items rather than precious assets. Japan's carriers were irreplaceable treasures that couldn't be risked. America's carriers were industrial products built by the dozens, and in that transformation from 3 carriers fleeing Pearl Harbor to 99 carriers accepting Japanese surrender lay the foundation for 75 years of American naval dominance. The Fast Carrier Task Force doctrine developed in 1943-1945 remained operational doctrine through the end of the Cold War. The logistics revolution pioneered by fleet. Train enabled global naval operations independent of fixed bases. The integration of radar, fighter direction, and damage control created carrier survivability that persists in modern supercarriers. Every lesson Japan learned through defeat, America implemented through victory. The final irony is perhaps the most poignant. Commander Fuchida, who led the attack that destroyed America's battleship fleet and validated carrier warfare, survived to watch Japanese carriers burn at Midway, then retreat from advancing American task forces, then surrender in Tokyo Bay surrounded by more American carriers than Japan possessed at the start of the war. He spent 40 years after the war reflecting on how Japan's greatest victory planted the seeds of its most complete defeat. His conclusion, written in 1982, shortly before his death, "We struck the sleeping giant and proved to them that carriers rule the seas. Then we gave them 3 years to build a carrier fleet that outnumbered ours 10-1. What we destroyed at Pearl Harbor was obsolete. What we awakened was unstoppable. We taught America how to fight the war we wanted to fight, then lost the war because they fought it better." History will record many Japanese failures in World War II. Our greatest failure was winning at Pearl Harbor so completely that we convinced ourselves we could win a long war against an enemy with unlimited industrial capacity. We couldn't. And the carriers we built to prove our naval mastery became floating museums. Before the war ended, while American carriers filled the horizons of the Pacific, the story of the Fast Carrier Task Forces from feared innovation to overwhelming dominance remains. A case study in how industrial warfare transforms tactical excellence into strategic irrelevance. In June 1942, 4 Japanese carriers dominated the Pacific. In June 1944, 16 American carriers dominated the same waters. The transformation took 24 months and was measured, not in naval battles but in shipyard production, pilot training pipelines, and logistics tonnage. And when Japanese admirals witnessed entire fleets retreat before American carrier task forces, they weren't retreating from superior tactics or better pilots. They were retreating from mathematics, from industrial capacity transformed into naval power, from the realization that courage and skill cannot overcome steel and numbers. That retreat, the final transformation of the war, echoes through naval history as the moment when industrial warfare's true nature became undeniable. Victory belongs not to the swift nor to the brave, but to those who can absorb losses and return tomorrow with more ships than they lost yesterday. And in that mathematical truth lay the foundation for American victory and Japanese defeat.